Next up, we have Professor Adelusi-Adeluyi from UC Riverside. And this is going to be a talk about Lagos. And I think we're going to read some maps against the grain and add some very exciting details to them. So very much pleased to welcome our next speaker. Are we ready to go?
Just 1 second while I set up. Oh, this is better. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now? Yes, perfect. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I want to join the other speakers in saying thank you to the hosts and organizers for putting together such a fascinating conference, which has been, I feel like I've learned a lot already. And I think my presentation, I was thinking was going to be really different, but it's going to be quite similar except without the bike. I should have had a bike to ride around Lagos, but anyway. So today I will be speaking about my research on the histories of mid-19th century Lagos, Nigeria, looking at how European maps can be interpreted in combination with oral sources, oral narratives and mythologies, and also the archive that's created by the urban fabric in the city itself. And all of this is coming together this analysis is coming to sort of think about how we can represent the lives of Yoruba-speaking people who lived and continue to live in Lagos now. Now, a lot of this mapping work, it's not moving. A lot of this mapping work is inspired by the work of the late historical geographer Akima Bagunje, whose research and writing on cities like Lagos has been really important as a model for younger scholars like myself who are interested in doing this kind of work, thinking about time and space and change in African cities. I always say when I present my work that there's a kind of blankness when when people generally think about Africa, African cities, this idea of thinking about the past in Africa. There's often this idea of open, rural, blank spaces, but some of the largest cities in the world actually do exist on the African continent, and some of them are quite old, like the one I'm interested in. So I always say there's a blankness to the understanding of the physical space where historical narrative unfolds in this part of Africa. And I like to balance this with a quote I used from a newspaper in the 19th century. So it was writing to the editor writing to somebody who wrote in with a letter. Joe, we have your letter, but we regret that it is crowded out of this issue. You forget that Lagos has what England has not, a climate. It is composed of equal parts sunshine, mosquitoes, sand, high temperature, sweetness, sound, fury, rain, rage, retribution, and that sort of thing. Anyone who's actually been to Lagos knows this is an understatement, actually, of what you will actually find when you get there. So the Yoruba-speaking people who made up the bulk of the Lagos population migrated there probably as early as the 17th century, and they built an indigenous cosmopolitan space that thrives at the center as the center of a lagoon network that runs parallel to the Atlantic Ocean. This dense, heterogeneous space was home to thousands of people who, despite their rich cultural expressiveness in song, in myth, in dance, and in narrative, were often non-literate. So this means that they didn't write these things down or draw their own maps, although we have evidence of them participating in the making of almost every map that I use in my research. At the same time, they built with semi-permanent materials that reflected their geography. So very often, because of colonialism, what we know of the history of the city has been wiped away over time by these layers of colonialism and other historical issues that happen. So what I want to share with you is how we can use these maps to think about the past and also the kinds of visualizations that are possible. So Old Lagos, that is the city, the island, the waterways, is never more visible until we see it actually being destroyed in the 1850s. And what we find is that the British actually launched 2 bombardments from the sea and the lagoon of Lagos Island and the city itself in 1851, flattening and destroying most of the city. And in doing this, they actually generated these maps that I'm showing you today, starting with these three here. And this is the first time we really see a visual representation that matches the oral narrative that we have. The places, the people, the experience, the mangroves, the water, all these cultural references actually come from this moment of destruction. So ironically, or well, maybe interestingly, I'm able to not look at this in the historiography. It becomes a debate over why did they do this? What was it for? They displaced one king and put in another king. So there's a lot of debate, I will say, in the male historiography about, who did what and why. But I'm really interested in interpreting this spatially, these violent acts. What does this tell us about the city? And what does this tell us about the maps? So these three sketches were actually created by naval officers on British ships engaged in the bombardment of the city in November and December 1851. An additional map from the series in 1859 complements these, as this is also another representation, which is a little bit hard to read, but we're seeing a lot of data that I use to extract what we know about Lagos in this. And I've already said that it's not ideal to do it this way, but this is basically what we have in terms of the other sources. Now, the image of Lagos that emerges from these sources, starting with the rubble and the ruins of the bombardment, is at odds with itself, fuzzy, incomplete, and sometimes contradictory. The effect is an uneven urban space superimposed on an island filled with swamps, creeks, small peaks, and dramatic slopes in the shallow lagoon that frames Lagos Island and other things, so we'll see. Now, we rarely find evidence in the traditional archive of ordinary days or ordinary people. Most of what we see is from the courtrooms, is from the bombardment, from newspapers. So we find these extraordinary events really being what shapes our understanding of the city in this way. And one of the things I'll add is nowadays when I do maps of Lagos, and I always say this, I really start now from this contemporary base, because this is what people in Lagos will recognize. A lot of the historical maps, because of the way that they're formed, they're not always so legible. So to make my work more legible to the kinds of audiences I'm interested in, people who are from Lagos, people who are interested in living in the city, how can we walk through the city and find the parts where the past still resides? So just to briefly say, this is a contemporary map of Lagos. It is one of the largest cities growing right now in the world. And so part of what we see when we think about Lagos is it's often framed in terms of, when we have urban conversations about Lagos, it's always framed in terms of problems. It's too big, too crowded, too much, right? But what I'm thinking about is a 19th century city that actually exists underneath this contemporary map of the city, and thinking about how we can find the rivers, the creeks, the lakes, all the other things that actually used to exist. And part of what I do with my mapping work is try to carve out, starting with the historical shoreline of the city, because I'm interested in framing the old city in what we recognize as Lagos today. So for instance, this map of the old shore comes from superimposing and you're referencing older maps of Lagos with the contemporary map. And with that, we can look and see, let's see if this map will work. So with one of these applications we call Spyglass, you can actually layer the past and the present, and you walk through Lagos. Well, it usually works, yes. So you can actually see the old city underneath the new city. And I'll talk a little bit about the work I do walking around Lagos. And so this is part of how I find the edges, the interior, and other things. And this lower graphic will become important because later I will show you how a creek and a swamp actually saved Lagos during the bombardment of the city in 1851. How am I doing? Okay, great. So dissatisfied with this aerial view that I had of the city, I started to venture out in the city. As I said, I was just walking in Lagos with my research partners and thinking, what can we find in the city itself? What kinds of material exists outside of let's say the European archive or other places or even maps? And how can we correlate this with the maps that we have? What we find is that traces of Lagos's history are actually embedded all over the city itself. One example I give before I move on is my work on the steam tramway that used to exist. One of the biggest bugbears in Lagos is this transportation issue. And one of the things we find is we used to actually have a tramway at the beginning of the 20th century. And you could actually get across the city really quite easily. So when I show these maps in Lagos and I show people, they're like, oh, we need to build this, we need to build that. There's all this new infrastructure that's coming. But it was there, and all over Lagos, you can see all of these historical material. So part of what I want to talk about is this, going back to the bombardment, this issue of walking in the city and streets. One of the things I discovered in walking in Lagos was that even though, thinking back to yesterday's presentation, there's not a lot of historical markers, there's not a lot of this information as you walk around. A lot of it is really still orally transmitted, but people are very attached to their history. But one of the things I discovered in walking in Lagos is how the historical record has actually been preserved in the street network name that emerged in the in the middle of the 19th century. So after the British bombarded Lagos and put a new king in power, an Oba, as we say in Yoruba, they actually annexed the city 10 years later in 1861. And what happened is that they changed roads, widened them, they did all of these things. And then unlike most colonial cities, the streets of the Lagos network actually are all indigenous Yoruba names. So where you would expect to find names of the colonial administrators or others, it's actually Balogun Street, Tinubu Street, all of these things that actually represent local people, their beliefs, and enslaved people, free people, things about local beliefs, cultures, all of this. And what I want to focus on today, this idea of bombardment and the part of Lagos that was saved. So in my book that was mentioned earlier, Imagine Lagos, I offer perspectives of how to interpret the past, and each chapter is actually located at a different intersection in the city. I don't have a pointer, but the bombardment is there at the intersection of Lake and Elegbata, which is what I'm going to share with you for the rest of the time that I have. So what do we learn from the bombardment of Lagos? There's a treasure trove of letters, maps, sketches, and newspaper articles, all describing what happened when the city was bombarded in 1851. And in reading this material, you start to see for the first time, or at least myself, someone who's born in Lagos and is a historian of Lagos now, reading these materials and reading through and against the grain in that sense, you start to see they talk about what's destroyed, who lived where, how women and children escaped, where they went across the lagoons, all of those kinds of things. So for me, this is an incredible treasure trove of thinking about the past in this sense. One of the things that was most striking for me in the sources is a letter where after one of the naval officers talks about, he's glad to report to you that the town has been destroyed, but there was, which some people describe as a lucky shot. He also writes in the letter, a creek and a swamp running about 200 yards inland had checked the flames and saved the eastern division of the town. So I became very curious about what this street and lake may be. I was like, a street and a lake in Lagos? This is fascinating. So I'm walking around and doing this archival work and urban work, and then I ran into Lake Street, right at the intersection of where the city was. And then I also ran into Elegbata Street, right there. That's that intersection in chapter 2 I'm talking about. And right there, as you see on the map, is actually where that lake and the creek to the north, and there's a lake to the north. So I wondered, in thinking about this, what other patterns are there? What we find when we read these patterns is these histories of men and women all over Lagos, embedded all over the city. So part of what I'm doing in my visualizations is also thinking about ways to anchor people's stories where people might emerge as blips in the narratives or blips in the archive. They really often don't have a story or an extended story that you can tell. But one of the things you see is that because missionaries and others who were in Lagos after the bombardments, they walk around the city, they take people's stories and they write them down, but they're often very small vignettes. So part of what we can do in visualizations is really think about streets and place, and how when we think about old Lagos, we can match places and streets and think about the past in really fascinating ways. So thinking about that intersection I mentioned of Lake Street that intersects with other streets as well that tell really interesting stories about people coming back to Lagos. So for me, I'll end with how I'm anchoring 3 or 4 stories in walking through the past and present in Lagos and giving voice to some of these encounters and people that exist. Now, Lagos's archive is often around issues around, the written archive is often about conversion, moving people from, indigenous worship of Orisha to Christianity. And so we have these letters, and I wanted to show examples of the kinds of people I've anchored in space in the previous image. Many of these are people who are enslaved because this is what exists in our archive. Like I said, I don't have ordinary days. But these are stories I found really fascinating. One, for instance, is an excerpt of an encounter of a man who actually came back to Lagos after he had been enslaved and confronted the person who enslaved him. And this spills out in the streets. And we can tell this story because I mapped that indigenous quarter, and I know from the missionaries walking around the city, I know where he's going and where this possibly happened. And they say, little did you think of seeing me again when that morning you ordered me to be sold to the Portuguese. So these really dramatic stories that happen. or somebody else, a really famous reverend who was also enslaved but rescued by the ships of the Preventative Squadron and brought back to Lagos. And part of what he sees is he can narrate the changes in the city. He talks about where he was enslaved or beaten, that is now a really well-known church that was built on top of this site and this barracoon. So we have all of these stories, and of course, others stories that come from there, and people often talking about their experiences in Lagos. So what we find in doing this work and creating and marking space in Lagos, that this actually allows more voices to enter the narrative. And as I continue my archival work and also work in Lagos, I'm hoping to build a richer trove of the kinds of voices we have and how we can illustrate their experiences. We also even have depositions of people returning from places like Cuba and Brazil. They describe the city that they lived in, and they talk about the longing that they had and the places that they were in Lagos. So this material that, as I said, exists in this kind of blank canvas, I'm really trying to bring place. So in a way, these infographics are different because data-rich societies like the United States, you can make different kinds of things, but really what I want to do here in my work in Lagos is really bring a sense of place and actual position to thinking about the past in these places. I will end with reflecting on the idea that Lagos actually means lagoons in Portuguese. So there's a vast history of water and other narratives in Lagos that I really want to bring together in thinking that, Lagos it's an island and a city, but also the water has really important narratives for us. So I will end here. Well, it ended for me. Thank you. Move all my stuff.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ademide. That was incredible and inspiring. And we ended very perfectly on the theme of water as well, which I imagine will be a recurring subject. So